I wanted to talk briefly about African American theater and its evolution in the past 30 or 40 years. Much of what I say about African American theater I think can be applied to the efforts of other minorities or underrepresented groups in American culture to find or build institutions to represent their experience of the world. So some of the comments I make about African American theater I think have some application to other cultures in our society that have difficulty in building opportunities in theater and in performance to represent their unique experience of American society and of life within the communities that are unique to them. Let me review the situation in the 1960s. I made reference to this earlier in videos about the 1960s. You may recall in one of the videos I discussed Lorraine Hansberry and the tremendous she had with A Raisin in the Sun on Broadway. And that play resonated throughout the United States and made her famous as a bold spokesperson for African Americans who had been discriminated against in regard to opportunities for better housing and the moving story of this family's efforts to move out of a ghetto into an integrated neighborhood reinforced the need for a new understanding of race in our society and relations between the so-called races. And it contributed heavily to the development of the civil rights movement. But Hansberry was skeptical of her own success because she understood that change for African Americans in the United States really depended on a more volatile and impatient attitude toward change than perhaps the audiences that appreciated A Raisin in the Sun were to wield knowledge or approve, so to speak. And so her aesthetic became more radical in its representation of black experience. But she died too soon for her voice and authority as an author to achieve the impact that she had hoped to as an artist. About a few years later, after A Raisin in the Sun, LeRoy Jones emerged. He later changed his name to Amiri Baraka. But back in 1964, he was LeRoy Jones, who had a kind of drifting existence until after he got Air Force, he decided he had something to say and was going to put it into words and in dramatic form. So he had a big success with a one-act play in 1964 on Broadway called Dutchman. It started in a smaller theater and worked its way up to Broadway and then movie. It's a very searing kind of compressed drama about how a black man who is trying to find his way in white society, is a kind of Wall Street broker type corporate man, encounters on the subway in New York a destructive white woman who derails his whole life and her purpose seems to be to assert her own as a white woman, to capture and possess black men and then destroy them. So that play also resonated very, very well back in the 1960s, and became a very controversial, much talked about play about how accurate it was in its portrayal of racial relations. One thing, however, that was accurate about the play was the extent to which racial relations became embedded in sexual relations, and that Hansberry didn't handle in A Raisin in the Sun, although she did in subsequent works that never got performed. Baraka was really focused on making that connection because he felt that it was the foundation for racial discrimination, the underlying sexual relations between people across races. At any rate, Jones, like Hansberry, then soon after repudiated Broadway and the white theater institutions, feeling that he could only gain entry into them if he wrote plays that accommodated the expectations of white audiences, and that even though both his play and Hansberry's play were successful, they didn't really attract much in the way of black audiences. And black audiences seemed left out of the theater that was about them by black authors, when it was up to the white institutions to present the vision of American life that black authors wished to share. So black experience in the 1960s remained filtered through white institutions. It was very difficult for black actors and writers to expand opportunities for their talent. They were completely dependent on white institutions, white producers, white directors, white casting agents, and white audiences to have opportunities to display their talent as actors or writers or designers. And those opportunities were too few to meet the demand that they felt was being kind of suppressed by this assumption that the audiences for theater on Broadway and throughout the nation were fundamentally white. Up until the 1960s, black writers had been very busy writing plays, and many of them are available in the North American database through the library. It's a wonderful collection, very diverse, dating back to the 19th century, of black writers creating stories and plays, dramas about experience of being black in different zones of life and different occupations, different kinds of experiences, romantic, comic, tragic, political, social and cultural, but these plays never found their audience. They remained stuck in libraries or books because the resources were not available to build the kind of institutional infrastructure that would allow for their production. So black writers wrote many plays, and a very lively imagination was at work in the literary sense, but the sources were not available to get them performed. Black theater up until the 1960s remained confined largely to Harlem in New York, and even there, most of the theater that took place was in the way of revues or nightclub acts and musical shows, which lacked a focus on personal and collective issues facing the African American world. Mostly what you saw at the Apollo Theater or the Cotton Club or other nightclubs in the Harlem theater culture were musical shows that occasionally made fun of black life, or celebrated or memorialized the experiences of blacks in song and dance, but didn't provide any kind of dramatic context for some impact to be made as a result of theater. It wasn't focused on changing audiences or changing conditions for the audience. So the theater resources in Harlem remain too weak and too undeveloped to support dramatic playwrights. So earlier in the 1930s, and Broadway had absorbed black culture in relation to white understanding of it, and shows like Porgy, which became the opera Porgy and Bess, and Showboat were musicals that featured blacks, or even Porgy were about blacks, and these resonated very well to this day. They're still great shows, but they are shows that represent how white people, the white creators, saw black experience. And it's not that blacks could not appreciate that perspective. The problem was that black way of seeing things didn't have any space. There was no, not sufficient strength within the institutions to accommodate their particular experience of the world. I could also mention Orson Welles. He did a Macbeth in the 1930s, was very famous, all-black cast, and set in Haiti, Macbeth, the Shakespeare play, and had all blacks in it. Or Eugene O'Neill in his 30s also did Emperor Jones, about a dictator in Haiti who was on the run when the people of the kingdom he rules turn against him, and it's all black cast. But these are white people finding a way in which to use black people to represent a larger visual than they feel as white people they can do separately from blacks, but at the same time it doesn't accommodate the black perspective in any way other than this is the white man's view of things. So Baraka had complained that the whites had sort of made it possible for him and other blacks to have a place in their theater, to the extent that their black writing about theater was in accordance with how whites wanted to see blacks. And even if whites wanted to see blacks, like radical blacks, Revolutionary Malcolm X or Black Panthers, it was always a construction that met a white need rather than a black need. In the late 1960s, you had this movement toward colorblind casting, whereby blacks had opportunities to appear in white plays that were not written with the idea that they should be played by blacks. For example, Shakespeare. It was, by the late 1960s, acceptable to think that a play like Romeo and Juliet or Julius Caesar could be played, all of the characters in it, different characters in it, could be played by blacks, and people wouldn't see that they were blacks. Shakespeare didn't write with black people in mind, and when he was writing about Julius Caesar or Macbeth or Midsummer Night's Dream, he didn't see them in mind, but they nevertheless found a place in his plays, because by doing so, white people could show that Shakespeare embraced everybody and absorbed them, and there was always a place for different kinds of people to be in Shakespeare's plays. But once you get out of this non-realistic or old kind of theater, it became increasingly difficult to cast blacks in non-black roles, especially if you were focused on realism in the plays, as were many people at that time, from the 50s onwards, even earlier. So in any case, colorblind casting had limited capacity to open up opportunities for blacks, especially if they sought to a kind of theater that represented black experience from a black perspective. Okay, so by the mid-1960s, after Dutchman and Baraka's decision to abandon Broadway to pursue a different kind of theater, African Americans, starting in New York City, began to develop an alternative institutional approach to the representation of African American experience in the theater. Douglas Turner Ward, in 1967, I believe, 1965, I think, yeah, 1965, established the Negro Ensemble Company, which still exists. It's still the big theater up in Harlem. And the Negro Ensemble Company, he set up to perform his own plays. He wanted a place to stage works that he had in mind for African American audiences. So the Negro Ensemble Company was an effort to establish a black theater. The subject was black experience, written by black authors, produced by black people, for black audiences. It's not that white audiences weren't invited. They certainly, anybody could come, but they wanted a theater that was of their making and meant to represent an experience that was not getting represented through the traditional white institutional structure. So the Negro Ensemble Company, beginning in 1965, began small, then built up very, very rapidly into the 1970s and 80s. Ward wrote plays. He got some recognition from prizes and awards, but largely stopped writing after the 1970s. He was an actor as well as he directed and wrote plays, filling all these different functions. But by the mid-1970s, his company had become fairly large and had a pretty elaborate apparatus, board of directors and different people involved. And it certainly educated and provided numerous opportunities for a lot of talent, African American talent, that otherwise might not have had opportunities to develop. Many actors that are famous now got their start with the Negro Company, but just to mention Angela Bassett, Denzel Washington, Lawrence Fishburne, Samuel L. Jackson. Those are just a few through the Negro Ensemble Company, and went on to become very big. theater and then film, and many others went into television. So that was immensely successful and showed how significant it was for African Americans to be in control of their own institutions if they were to have a kind of impact on the culture as a whole that they wanted to make without being dependent on white institutions to provide those opportunities. So, as I say, the Negro Ensemble Company is still working, it's still very busy. But Amiri Baraka had a different approach, and in the 1970s, he had written many plays. You're going to be reading The Motion of History next week, and then we kind of compare that with August Wilson. We're a little behind schedule, but Amiri Baraka had come to the conclusion that even the Negro Ensemble Company wasn't really revolutionary enough, it wasn't radical enough to transform American culture to the extent necessary to bring about greater justice and equity for not only for African Americans but for what he called the working class. Baraka adopted Marxist theory to guide his philosophical perspective, and he wanted a theater that awakened revolutionary energies in the audience. And that meant a theater that was much more provocative and controversial than what went on in the Negro Ensemble Company, which often focused on domestic concerns or the struggles of ordinary African Americans to escape desperate conditions or to achieve some kind of dignity that they felt they deserved. Baraka had a more pessimistic view of the power of that kind of theater to produce social change. And so he wrote numerous plays of an increasingly strident and critical nature informed by this Marxist philosophy. The Motion of History is an example. It's one of his best plays. It's pretty well written, and it's very innovative. He was very imaginative. Douglas Turner Ward and Ed Bullins is another one I'll mention. They remained faithful to realism, you might say. They wanted to capture how African Americans talked, the variations in speech, the way they moved, and ways that were familiar to African American audiences. So they were devoted to realism. Baraka was not a realist. He wanted to be free of the kind of constraints on imagination that realism seemed to entail. So his plays and his kind of theater moved in a much more experimental and speculative way, whereby bodies on stage articulate positions and ideological viewpoints and fantasies and desires that are larger than any one individual, but nevertheless define the way people are in their relations between each other and toward the future, toward the past, and toward things like slavery and freedom and equality and so forth. So it's a more abstract kind of theater, but at the same time it's more focused on the reality of all kinds of realities that that conventional realist theater just doesn't acknowledge in its plays, where there's so much focus on personal relations rather than historical and economic relations. So Baraka, in any case, decided he wasn't going to have the kind of theater that Douglas Turner Ward and Ed Bullins were pursuing. He moved to Newark, New Jersey, and there he declared a section of Newark as an independent country. It was a symbolic gesture, but it resonated. He said, this is a place that is entirely black. And he produced this theater. It was a theater company that, like the Negro Ensemble Company, produced only the work of black artists, and was only involving black audiences. And this was, you know, the Negro Ensemble Company, they put white actors in a play if the black playwright wanted a white person in the play. And they certainly had no objections to white people coming to their plays. They encouraged it. Believed, as you know, Hansberry had originally, in the idea of integration, that the races should be together in understanding each other. Baraka didn't believe that, and he wanted a theater in which whites were excluded. They couldn't go to the theater. They weren't allowed in to the theater, and no whites could be a part of their productions. Everything was totally black in this black republic or kingdom or whatever that he symbolically established in Newark, New Jersey. And it wasn't that he meant to be taken all that seriously in terms of all this exclusivity, but for many white people, you had no understanding of discrimination or segregation until you yourself are discriminated against or excluded. And this gesture of setting up this all-black theater that only black people had access to was a way of making that point dramatically. And for this theater, Baraka did all these interesting plays, including The Motion of History. Even if you had white people in it, they had to be played by black people, just the way white people played black people back in the 19th century with the minstrel show. So this is the radical aesthetic at work, the work of a revolutionary mind. But Baraka went beyond establishing this theater. He actually stopped writing plays by the end of the 1970s and moved to an entirely different kind of performance. And you can see many examples of this on YouTube, of these. It's a kind of performance, it's like rap, but it's involved with jazz and blues music, and he speaks and interacts with musicians, saxophonists and bass players and pianists and whatnot, and it's a very improvised kind of performance. He writes things out, but then he doesn't say everything he writes, and he says other things besides what he writes, and it's a, you know, and he sometimes involves other performers in a very jazz-like creation of voice and gesture and performance. He has become more of a poet who performs than a dramatist who explores conflicting forces as drama is expected to do. And many of his poetic performances are like rants or proclamations or condemnations. This language sort of spills out of him in a very rhythmic, jazz, syncopated way, and in connection with the music, and for him that is the process of evolution from Dutchman to this poetic voice, elaborating on the themes in his mind and heart in conjunction with musicians who somehow intensify that radical poetic moment through performance. But I must say that since he went into that mode, he's probably exerted less influence, even if he's been much more prolific and embraced by many. But his power, you might say, to awaken engagement with racial issues has diminished as he has moved toward this poetic improvisation. When he was setting up this Republic and this exclusive theater, he really made a big point, and he had plays like The Motion of History that gave a kind of authority to that approach. But it's an exhausting kind of enterprise, and I can imagine that after a few years of doing it, I can see where he might feel the need for a change. Meanwhile, as Baraka began to settle and mellow, August Wilson became a big name in African American drama and theater in the 1980s, when he embarked on a huge project to write plays on every aspect, or on every decade of African American experience since the 1890s up until the time he was living. So it was to consist of 10 plays, so 100 years of African American experience covered in 10 plays, one per decade. Fences is one of the late plays, but Ma Rainey's Black Bottom deals with the 1920s and the singer. There's a whole series of these, and I have a special, trying to put together a video about August Wilson. But he became really controversial in the 1990s when he declared, he's dead now, he died just a couple of years ago, a year or so ago. In the 1990s, early 1990s, it became quite controversial when he said that he did not want his plays had won Pulitzer Prizes, he was very famous, but he said he didn't want white people handling his plays, only black people should perform them, that blacks should not perform with white theaters, and he was advocating a really segregationist approach to theater. He felt that all the theater institutions in the United States had failed. Not even Baraka was saying that black actors shouldn't work with whites. He just said that in his theater there weren't going to be whites working with black actors. But Wilson advocated a kind of segregated approach that even many in the African American world felt was not the best way to go. But he was and remains, even though he's dead, the most prominent African American playwright. Certainly, I can't think of anyone any other author who has pursued such a huge ambition and been so successful at it. But his 10 plays are quite remarkable. Fences is a very, very fine play. I don't know that it's the strongest in the 10 play project, but it's nevertheless one of his most famous and popular. And all of the plays have a kind of extraordinary power to them, and if you see all 10 or read all 10, you get a really immersive experience of African American life over a century. And it's hard to think of any author with as big an ambition, or any dramatist with such a big ambition. It was quite extraordinary. But he tied that ambition to an idea of theater that really was the opposite entirely of where Lorraine Hansberry had hoped way back in 1959 when she wrote A Raisin in the Sun. It's not an integrated kind of theater. He doesn't have any hope for that. He's profoundly disappointed with the way the theater world has operated. He got very upset with white directors for the way they directed his plays and didn't direct them the way that playwrights are always complaining about directors and what they do, but he took it very seriously and complained publicly about the situation, and then declared that all African American artists of the theater should have nothing to do with the white theater, and that white people should have nothing to do with his plays, and that they had no white directors, white producers, had no real authority to cast plays or to make decisions about who's in them or how they're done and so forth, which didn't prevent white theater companies from nevertheless staging August Wilson's plays, because they did. They started doing that when he became famous in the 1980s and then the 1990s. They still do it now. Wilson died. He was, I suppose, kind of embittered by his experience. Even though he had been very successful, he was kind of embittered. But in any case, he died without his dream actually coming true. And perhaps the strain of trying to make this point assisted death in claiming him. Nevertheless, African Americans have the African American theater world has definitely, absorbed the lessons of the Negro Ensemble Company and Amiri Baraka and Lorraine Hansberry and August Wilson. The United States now has a widespread network of African American theaters. And all major cities seem to have at least one company that's African American in its identity. New York has, I think there are a couple now, but San Francisco has the African American Shakespeare Company. Is quite good. I saw an excellent production of Tennessee Williams' play Glass Menagerie with all black cast. Worked wonderfully, and some of these companies do that. They take white plays and put black actors in them, directed by black directors, black designers. Sometimes the African American companies bring in white actors to play roles. So it's kind of like the way white institutions were on Broadway toward black artists in the 1950s, reversed, with black theaters occasionally bringing in white designers or artists, or doing white plays like Tennessee Williams, but making them black, so to speak. But there's a widespread network. There's over 100 of these African American theaters throughout the United States. Some are very small, some are semi-professional, others are quite very high level of performance, like the African American Shakespeare Company in San Francisco. So in any case, the experience of African Americans in developing a theater culture can probably be applied to other minority, non-white cultures seeking to use theater to shape, present some kind of vision of their heritage and experiences in the United States or indeed in the world. So Filipino American companies or Chicano or Mexican American theater. Probably talk about these a little later on, but African American theater had a very special experience going back many decades into the 19th century after the freeing of the slaves, and as a result of the evolution of the African American experience in the theater, it's clear that fundamental tensions between the races have not been resolved to the point where we can say that our theater institutions are really integrated, and that the experience of African Americans is fundamentally different from that of the dominant culture in the mainstream theater apparatus for the United States. Well, we'll talk about Baraka's play and August Wilson's play in subsequent video.